Hi, everybody. Brett Mitchell here, music director of Your Colorado Symphony. Very pleased to be welcoming you to another of our virtual music hours. This weekend's program is a bit different from those we've presented thus far in this series. Given the events of the past few weeks here in America and around the world, we thought we would take the opportunity to have an unscripted and candid conversation between me and one of my friends and colleagues in the orchestra, our principal violist, Basil Vendryes. We're very happy to be sharing with you on this program music by Duke Ellington, his wonderful final work, Three Black Kings, as well as Aaron Copland's presentation of the words of Abraham Lincoln in his Lincoln portrait. I think you'll find both the conversation that Basil and I had, as well as the performances themselves, meaningful and timelier than ever. We hope that you enjoy both this conversation and these performances of these two extraordinary works.
While I was trying to come up with ideas of things to talk about today, was thinking how much that altruism that we live with, that music is without color, it's the international language, it's what everybody understands. And that's true. But what we don't always consider is that the people who are creating it are of color. So when you listen to the radio, you don't think twice, or listen on your stereo. You don't really think about it. But when you walk into the performing space, or have access to the visual aspect of what we do, suddenly there is that aspect of what we do that comes into play. It's a weird thing. I was also thinking, I've always lived by the idea of what I do is not with race, is not with color. It's trying to bring forth the music of whoever it is that is on my desk. But while it doesn't matter to me as much as especially in the last couple of decades, it has become clearer and clearer to me how much it matters to the community. And this comes after years and years of either being asked, am I the only black person in the orchestra? Or why aren't there more people of color in the orchestra? And my answer has generally been, they didn't win the audition. We don't have that many auditions when you think about it. And no one of color has managed to, win a spot, either in our orchestra or in the other orchestras I was a part of. When I joined the San Francisco Symphony, I was the only black person in that orchestra for a long, long time. And when I joined the New York Philharmonic, it was myself and Jerry Ashby were the two guys. And now that orchestra, I don't believe, has anyone of color. And in San Francisco has one horn player. How do we solve that problem? I don't think it's by changing the way that we do things in terms of the process. Because that's not fair to everyone. I do think that what does need to happen is there needs to be more education and skill building for people of color. And even more importantly than that, it's getting numbers to show up. I told you about that symposium I went to that the New World Symphony sponsored. And a lot of interesting things came out of that. But the bottom line is, let's say you hold an audition, 100 people show up, 70 of them are white, 20 of them are Asian, 5 of them are Latino, and 5 of them are black. What are the odds?
Right.
So, if we can get ourselves to a place, and this is why the New World Symphony, I think, was really brilliant in coming and also working with the panel that they had there, to create a forum to help young, skilled players of color develop their talent, so that you have 20 black people show up to an audition. Now, that by itself is just like, wow.
Right.
Their odds become greater.
Yeah.
It's not about a person not being talented enough. It's about, the dice.
Yeah.
It's
the
about
odds.
the dice.
Yeah. So, for you, when you were coming up then, and you were one of one or one of two or however many it was, how was that for you? Surely you had mentors along the way that gave you advice coming up?
I had mentors. There were not that many mentors of color. I don't know if you know George Taylor, who's my colleagues who teaches at Viola at the Eastman School. He was one of the up-and-coming young black players of violin and viola when I was in high school. And I wouldn't go so far as to say he took me under wing, but he paid attention to me, and he befriended me, and I will always appreciate that. And we are always in contact. It's so ironic that I wrote a letter on to support him for his tenure up to full professor. That's how ironic is that?
Yeah.
But he was a person, along with my instructors, that just really nurtured me, and they were supportive and positive about my skill level, my talent, and making me feel like I had a go at it. But in terms of what was going on in high school, I went to a school that was, at one time, was a primarily white school, but with a few black people in it. And by the time I got to that school in 1975, there were 3 white people in the school, and it was a primarily black institution. I don't know that it didn't affect me. A lot of folks, I was called the musician. That kind of set me apart. I did things that were different than the average person did. There was a lot of folks that were interested in sports. There was a lot of great singing that was going on. But in terms of classical arts, there were very few people who had that kind of interest. So I was set apart. I was not badgered or anything like that. But I gained a lot of respect in that community. I mean, I said they didn't know my name, but they called me the musician. I was the musician.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, but then I went to the Manhattan School of Music Prep on Saturdays for 3 years, and there were, I think, in my 3 years there. So this is the opposite. There were maybe three or four people of color that were there. Again, it didn't occur to me that was a problem. And it's not a problem in the larger sense. It's not a problem because we are all there to make music. We're not there to talk about race relations. But it's interesting how when you become a professional and play concerts for any number of people, number of forums, how the audience catches the fact that there's only one person of color on stage. And Charlie Burrell and I talked about that very little. Sam Gell and I talked about that as well. And when I came to this orchestra, I was the third black guy in the orchestra, and they were, I wouldn't call them mentors either, but I do remember both of them saying to me in different ways, so I'm paraphrasing, how important it was for me to represent. That's a meaningful thing, to make sure that I stand tall for the black community, for the ethnic community in Denver, and be as helpful as I can be. And I've tried to be. I don't think I've gone the full measure of what I'm capable of doing, and I certainly have stood ready whenever I'm asked to do things.
Is that something you grew up with? That kind of stand up for that, or was it?
I don't. My parents were, and I always have to say, I'm not African American. My heritage has black blood in it, but my parents came from Jamaica. My mother came from Panama. My father came from Jamaica, but there was the slaves came from the same place. Right. So I hesitate to say that I understand the African American experience. I do understand the black experience very well, and they are in some ways the same. But I think that the roots are a little bit deeper with the African American experience. So my parents were, or my family was not, big on standing up for being black, but they were about being proud, for sure. But I never felt like I had to go out of my way, to stand up for the cause.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, when we're dealing with something like music, I've never sensed that cause, if you will, that it's for, look, a black person can do this. But as I was saying earlier, I think that for the young people of today, and certainly the current generation and the generation before it, I think that it is about, look, a person of color can do this. And it was not as front and center. In my mind, certainly the events of late have brought it certainly to the forefront. But I've not ever thought that it needed to be my duty. I'm not going to be someone who's going to tell, a young person of color comes up to me and says, how hard is it? If a person of any color comes up to me and says, how hard is it? I'm going to say, it's freaking hard. Yeah. This field is hard for anyone. I think about, my friend David Kim, who's concertmaster of Philadelphia. He waited tables, waiting his turn. Yeah. And it worked out. And he deserved it, because he's a darn great player and a great person, too. But, it requires patience and wherewithal. And more than that, talent and skill. Anyone who puts their mind to it, regardless of their color, is capable of excelling. So.
Yeah. Can we talk about the pieces on this week's virtual music hour?
Mr. Ellington.
Mr. Ellington.
The Duke.
The Duke. Sir Duke, as I grew up calling him, thanks to Stevie.
Yeah, what a great piece.
Seriously.
And what's interesting about Duke, certainly we play enough of his music in the pop genre. It's one of the great things about the Colorado Symphonies, that we do so many different kinds of things. And more often than not, we will play some of Duke's music in that kind of a show. But serious music, he didn't write that much of it.
Right.
But it's first-rate stuff.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine that someone would come to a concert of ours and say, "What is Duke Ellington doing on a program with Dvorak and Schwantner?" No, maybe they're just trying to butter us up, give us a little light pops stuff. And they're just like, they listen to this music and
Seriously.
say, "Whoa, this is the Duke Ellington I didn't know."
Yeah, so it's like the last piece he ever wrote, Three Black Kings.
That's right.
Wrote it in 1974, and didn't even finish it. But it's, when I first discovered this piece for myself, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago when I was living in Cleveland, when I was working at the Cleveland Orchestra. And I remember I got to know the last movement first, which is the specific tribute to Dr. King.
Right.
And then I listened to the other two movements, and not only was I like blown away by the music, but that first movement in particular, the way the first movement begins, I played that, like I would pull it up on like Spotify on my phone, and I would play it for my wife, I would play it for like some of you guys in the orchestra, and be like, name the composer. Name the composer. And not one person got anywhere within shouting distance of Duke Ellington, because it doesn't sound like Sophisticated Lady. It doesn't sound like Solitude, Right. It's a whole different kind of music making that he was trying to do at the end, which I think is just totally brilliant.
I mean, I don't know enough about the background of the piece, but was he trying to make a statement? Well, besides the obvious of the choice of the three kings.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely started as a tribute to Dr. King, and because they were apparently close, and had a good relationship. And Dr. King was killed, in '68, and this piece was written 6 years later. But the first movement to come out of it was that last movement, that tribute to Dr. King. And then I think there's a little bit of confusion about exactly what the piece was intended for, and it never got finished. As I mentioned, this was a very Duke Ellington kind of thing, though, right? I mean, he was a band leader for years. I'll finish it the day we do it. It's fine. I might have a better idea. But it was interesting. It was to be danced, and there's all sorts of reports of what may or may not have happened, and there's like half a dozen different orchestrations of it, again because Duke didn't live to see the thing come to fruition. But what a really awesome piece, and to open a concert that also had that concert was the Gershwin Concerto in F. With Joyce Yang and the John Adams City Noir on the second half, which was so great to do, and it was kind of a jazz in the concert hall type thing, and even that is an interesting conversation to have. I mean, I grew up, when I was in Seattle as a little boy, I grew up listening to pop music first, and then I listened to jazz. I got to jazz before I ever got to classical music. And so it's not a huge surprise that people like Leonard Bernstein, Gunther Schuller are big. I'm such a huge fan of them. But I think that crossing of genres, which is what that whole program was about. I think we played that program in September of 2018.
Yeah, that's right.
That kind of cross-pollination, and maybe the putting of composers onto a program that as you said at the beginning of the conversation, maybe they're just giving us a little bit of fluff here at the beginning of the show, or maybe they're giving these composers all had something really important to say, Ellington and Gershwin and Adams, genre regardless,
But the Duke, the writing that he had served a different crowd. He was dealing with nightclubs and smoky rooms and being able to create atmosphere in a relatively intimate space. And I found it very enlightening to listen to this music that suddenly was very spacious. That he was thinking, maybe I'm wrong, but he was thinking about, this is not being played in the Village Vanguard. Right. This is being played in a room like Betcher Concert Hall, and getting sound and color and character 300 feet. instead of 25 feet.
Yeah.
What kind, the kind of writing, the kind of instrumentation, all those kind of things, I think he really excelled at. And I thought it was a really fun piece. And we, of course, had done it one time previous to the time that we had done it here. And that we did it with you. I think we did it with Aaron. And it was a really nice revisit.
Yeah.
For sure. So.
Yeah. And the other piece comes from a different program, same seasons, the 18-19 season. But the other piece that we're sharing this weekend is Aaron Copland's Lincoln Portrait. It's funny, I've done, I mean, I'm not going to get a lot of sympathy from you. I don't know how many Lincoln Portraits I've done. Maybe a dozen. I'm sure you've done more than that. But there's something about the piece where it's like, there's a lot of pieces you can do a dozen times and get jaded about pretty easily. This is not one of those pieces for me. And I have had a couple of incredibly moving experiences doing this piece. And it was always because of who the narrator was and what the context of the performance was. Is this a piece for you as somebody that's been doing this, 5 or 10 years now?
Yeah.
Is this a piece for you that are you kind of over it, or is this something that's special?
I was thinking, because my colleague Bob Spillman, I don't know if probably your wife knows Bob Spillman, but he was sharing recently on Facebook his experiences getting to know William Warfield.
Oh, wow.
And my first Lincoln Portrait was with William Warfield.
God. Right.
And I was 18?
Where was it?
At Eastman.
At Eastman.
And I remember it well, but I don't know how you were as a young person. When I was growing up in the 60s and early 70s, there'd be all these great songs, all the Beatles songs, all the the songs of the what's called Summer of Love, blah blah blah. And I, as an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, I wasn't listening to the words. I was listening to the melodies and the rhythms and the choruses, and so I might be able to sprinkle a couple of words in there, here and there, until maybe Simon and Garfunkel, and then I actually started listening to the words and understanding that they're trying to actually say something.
Right.
So this is to say that the first time I did a Lincoln Portrait, I didn't listen to the words as carefully. Like you would hear, certainly some of the openings of each. This is what Abraham Lincoln said. This is what he said. Blah 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 da 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 da. And so I'm going after the power and the majesty of these blocks, these Trojan blocks of sound.
Right.
And then moving past, we did it with Gregory Peck in San Francisco. We did it with a number of great artists. But the last version that we did with Damon, that was something. That was really something. Not only in terms of his delivery, and we were on the same stage at the same time, so we can talk frankly about it. I mean, it was. Especially, was it the second night? Second night? I mean, we were speechless on the stage. I mean, there were tears coming down people's eyes. Between that and the Schwantner, which we'll share at another time, the import of those words. And it's not just the ability to deliver prose, but the sincerity and dedication with which he delivered those words brought that piece to a completely different level.
Absolutely. So the Damon that you mentioned is our mutual friend,
Yes,
as it turns out, Damon Gupton. You've known Damon for a long time. I've known Damon for a long time. The way this program actually came about, the program opened with the Copland Lincoln Portrait, and we did this wonderful piece by Joseph Schwantner, who taught at the Eastman School.
I did a premiere.
Oh, yeah?
I just premiered them.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So Schwantner wrote this piece based on the words of Dr. King called New Morning for the World, Daybreak of Freedom. And then on the second half of the program, we put the Dvorak New World Symphony. And the way the whole program came about was, as I mentioned, Damon and I have known each other for quite a long time. And we were just having a kind of regular conversation via text as we do. And he said at some point, he said, man, I would love to narrate Lincoln Portrait sometime. And, you know, Damon is not only a brilliant actor, but Damon is a brilliant musician. It's kind of maddening. And he's handsome and all the other things. Jeez. But, you know, when somebody like Damon Gupton says to you, I'd really like to narrate Lincoln Portrait, you say, okay, yes, and what else can we do while you're here in town? Which is how we did the Schwantner New Morning for the World.
Was that his first time?
I don't know if it was his first time. I think he's conducted it before, but I don't know that he had ever narrated it before. But, I mean, it was such an incredibly moving experience for all of us. And I don't say that in the trite way of, like, golly, that Mahler 6 was such a... And you mean it when you say it with Mahler 6, but this is a different kind of, as you were saying, this was a different kind of performance. And it was really special being in the hall that weekend and hearing him speak both the words of President Lincoln and then 100 years later, the words of Dr. King. I thought it was it's one of the weekends that I have been proudest of during our time together at the college.
No, it's chilling. Symphony. Absolutely chilling.
Yeah.
And my question was, do you think that Beethoven or Bach, with the same exact output, living in the same time period that they lived in, would be as revered today if either of them had been black?
No, we wouldn't even know their names.
And it's just very interesting. I got a lot of replies to it, and it became people were sharing it, and it was just a topic of discussion, including the fact that there is apparently a line in Beethoven's bloodline that is Moorish.
Right.
So, you know, there has been prognostication that maybe he was black. If we went by today's standards of 3% of your bloodline, somebody qualifies you as a black person.
Yeah.
You know, would that mean, would his music have been looked at differently? Some people said that he probably would have had to use a pseudonym. Some people said if he had been black, he probably would have been a servant of some sort, and he may have, if he had captured the mind and imagination of whoever he was working for, that they may have, he would have turned into an entertainment. And that his music would have gotten out that way. But the majority of people felt if he had been lucky enough to get any kind of education, he or Bach had gotten an education the way that they had in terms of learning how to write music, that at best they would have had to have some sort of a pen name.
And what do you think as the asker of that question? Can I ask you?
The music would have been just as good. I would not think of that any differently. But I also, unfortunately, would have to agree that would it have had the reach? Would it have made it onto the Sputnik or whatever it is that went up there?
Yeah.
Would that have changed our perception or the world's perception? And if the answer is yes, he would have been marginalized. We may never have heard of his music. That's an indication that something is seriously wrong.
And who's to say that there wasn't somebody with that level of talent that was black? And therefore, I mean, how do we know we didn't have that person, that hypothetical person that you're talking about? It seems seems unlikely just with the amount of people and talent in the history of the world that that person didn't exist. And that to me
Yep.
is the biggest heartbreaker. I heard a story from Leonard Slatkin, who heard from Slava Rostropovich. He was asked once, Slava was asked why he commissioned as much new music as he did. And Slava's response was, because I hate that a predecessor of mine as a cellist never went up to Mozart and said, "Would you write me a cello concerto?" And so we don't have a Mozart cello concerto. And that's a crime. And how, yes, it's a crime that we don't have a Mozart cello concerto, but how many people of color, how many women have simply not even been asked the question, would you write a piece for me? And that's sad, but I think that maybe the way, we have to thank, honestly, the whole metro area community here for showing us how truly important inclusion and equity and diversity is. And, we began our conversation by talking about performers of color in the concert hall, but we also need to talk about composers of color in the concert hall. The fact that we're even talking about playing a Duke Ellington piece is kind of part of the problem. That it's a thing that's worth talking about. Golly, we played a piece by an African-American composer. I mean, yeah, good. And we should be doing more of that. And we will be doing more of that. We must do more of that. We have been making great strides in diversifying our programming over the last number of years, including many more women and more people of color. But, talk is cheap, isn't it? I mean, there's been a lot of talk for a lot of years about doing this. And I think that I will say, as a white person that is the artistic leader of an organization that presents art, I think it's incredibly important, deeply and genuinely, that we are lifting every voice. It couldn't be more clear that representation in the concert hall matters. And I, for one, can't wait for the day when we don't have to talk about, we're programming a female composer this week, and we're programming an African-American composer and an Asian. It's like, this should just be part of what we do. And I think that we're all, listen, none of us are perfect, and we are going to get a lot of things wrong on the way to where we're going. But I also know from my conversations over the last couple of weeks with my colleagues in the Colorado Symphony, both on stage and in the administration, that everybody understands that the time for, platitudes is over. And it's really time to do something and have legit representation among the art that we present. I think it's really important.
Well, there is that audience goer who always will ask the question why, and it's often a naive question. Why aren't we just programming the things that I like to hear, the things that I know? If you program Beethoven 7, I'll be there. But I think that as we move forward with programming, that it's always about why. Why are we programming music of African American composers, of black composers, of Latino composers, of female composers? And I think it was you, maybe that first year, that I just remember some sort of blurb that we did, and it's like, trust us, trust the Colorado Symphony. we put our faith in you as our music director as well, that anything that we present to our audiences is going to be good.
Yeah.
It isn't because they're black or because they're female. It's because it is worth hearing. And I think that audience members have to come in with an open mind and seizing an opportunity to hear something new. And in some cases, it's hearing something old. There are so many fine composers of the previous century and of the current century, of color, of varying gender, if you will, that they are worth their salt. They are all worth their salt. And we have to work hard. If for us, also for our audience members to keep in mind, when we're seeing this stuff for the first time, it's good for us too. It is opening our ears. And many times we will begin a rehearsal session, but what is this? What is this doing on our desk? And it takes a couple of work and having, whether it's Brett or anyone else that is on the podium that is presenting this music, to explain it to us, to help us take it up. Not only put it together, but to take it apart.
Yeah, that's right.
So that we can understand it as it is being put together. And you know what? With very, very few exceptions, we have consistently offered great music by great composers, both living and dead, of color, of various nationalities. I think we're moving in the right direction. We just have to do more of it, and to bring that full circle, you gotta trust us, because I think that we've got good taste. We're going to bring you into the hall, and we hope that you leave having heard and enjoyed something different. And if you don't understand it, you may not necessarily get this particular idea. If you don't like it or don't understand it, come back the next day. Give it another go.
Yeah.
Ask questions. The talkbacks that we do.
Yeah.
Ask questions, because there is meaning behind every work that we put before you, regardless of who it's by. And I mean, there's some late Beethoven that's a little crazy out there too. And you do need more than one hearing of the Grosse Fuge to kind of get your head around it. Lord knows I do. But that's a genius.
So. Gustav Mahler said, "What does 'I don't like this' mean other than 'I don't understand this'?" And there's something about bridging that gap of what we understand and something that's outside of our experience. And I think that's the joy of classical music. Mm-hmm. It's the joy of art. And it also happens to be where all of us are right now as a society.
Yep.
And I think that marriage it has been a very helpful thing for me over the last number of weeks. Mm-hmm. And I hope that these performances that we're sharing this weekend of music by Duke Ellington and Aaron Copland, the words of Abraham Lincoln, as narrated by our brilliant mutual friend Damon Gupton, I hope this brings people some comfort and some solace right now. But I also hope that it encourages all of us to do legitimate thinking and soul searching, because where we have been is not where we are going, and that's right, and that's as it should be. And
completely agree.
And I'm very grateful to you, Basil, for sitting down today and having this conversation. Thank you.
I'm glad that you invited me. So.